G'day, I'm Patrick from Douglas Fir Design. Welcome to the workshop. Today I am going to take you through the process to get really tight, beautiful waterfall joints, which is a mitre joint that uses continuous grain. In particular, I'm going to show you a particular clamping caul that I use to make sure that you can apply the pressure you need to get these joints to close up tightly. I've been asked by a client to make a waterfall desk. This is just KD. It's kiln dried hardwood, structural hardwood. He supplied the timber. I've done some work like this for him before. I prefer to use furniture grade timber. It's normally dried to a higher standard, but this is what he's asked for. Anyway, the first thing I do when I'm gluing up a big panel like this is just lay out all the timber, figure out what's there, figure out what needs to be cut away, figure out any problem boards. I've laid all these out. They are all about 4.2 to 4.5. I need them to be 3.9 to do a waterfall desk. So I know I can lose, 200 to 400 mil on each board. And I'm going to go through and look at each end and see which end is the worst, what can be cut away, if there are any big knots that need to be removed. There was one extra board and it had this knot in it, which I didn't like. So that is the board that I'm not going to use. Like I said, I didn't choose this timber. You can see on the end here, there's some, checking or a little slice has come off the corner there. So I'm going to mark that there. So ideally I'm taking 4 meters from that point. I do the same thing with each board. Bit of a split here. I'm going to try and remove as much of that as I can. If the other end looks pretty good. And I'll always flip these up to look on the underside as well. And I can see that this end looks pretty good, but the other end, terrible. So I'm going to be losing as much as I can from this end on this board. Remove that if I can. I'll also do a preliminary layout and make sure I can get some sort of vaguely acceptable coloration, color gradient that I like, and see which boards need to go on the inside of the panel as opposed to the outside. I've written mid on this board because it's not great, but also it's got a whole bunch of this kind of checking and splintering on the underside. So I want to make sure this board goes in the center of the desk, not the outside. Very mid. All right, okay, I'm going to keep going, laying this out, measuring them out, and then I'll dock the excess off so that I'm working with the smallest size that I can. This is all getting glued up at length at 3.9 so that I can cut them to do those waterfall joins. And that's one of the main things that I want to show you in this video is the process of doing the waterfall joins. But I thought I'd throw you some little tips about gluing up along the way that you probably already know, but maybe you don't. So, a couple quick notes about my glue up setup. Kind of depends on the size of the piece I'm doing, but I have these big clamping cauls. They're about 1.8 meters long. Obviously, for most things, they don't need to be that long, but they're handy. I've put a strip of 3mm HDPE on the top edge. You can buy that in big sheets online. Glue doesn't stick to it, so it's more resilient than tape. And it also means that they're kind of nice and slippery for moving stuff around. Everything sits up on these little riser blocks, which is just any block that's the same height, and that means I can get F-clamps underneath. These wooden bars are not sitting directly on the tabletop. All of these have been done with biscuits. You could use dominoes or biscuits. It just means that there is less variation after the glue up for me to thickness or sand out. I'm going to talk through why clamping up miter joints is tricky. Some of this will be obvious to you, but I think it's helpful to have it drawn out so that you can see. When you're joining two pieces like this, and we're using a domino or a biscuit in here, the direction of force we need to be able to apply is like this. It's very difficult to apply force in that direction because the clamps just want to slide off. One way people get around this is using ratchet straps, which they wrap around the entire object, if it's a square like a picture frame. The problem with ratchet straps is they're applying a lot of pressure here, but it's not actually providing the closing pressure that we need in exactly the right place. One way to get around that is by placing something on this timber which gives you a flat platform that your clamps can sit on without sliding off. There's a couple of ways that people have done this. One way I've seen done, which I've tried myself, is you can glue a triangular block onto the face of the timber. Instead of gluing it directly onto the timber, you actually glue it onto some blue tape so that when you're finished, you can just kind of remove the blue tape and you don't have glue all over the piece. What I've found is that the clamping force required to close up that joint is often more than the strength of the blue tape. So in a critical moment, when I'm applying force to those glued on clamping blocks, the blue tape fails and the whole thing falls apart. It's terrifying because often you don't have very much time and it's very difficult to salvage at that point. A piece that you might glue onto the face could just look like this. And generally what people do is apply some blue tape to the workpiece and then apply some super glue to this and glue that onto the blue tape. I think if you're doing a small frame, something that didn't require a lot of force, that would be absolutely fine. But I've found with large pieces, the force required to close up those joints is just too high for the blue tape method. What I've come up with is, I haven't come up with it, I've probably seen someone doing it to be honest, is making a sandpaper plywood jig. What this means is that you've got your 45-degree angle there that you can apply the clamps to, and then you can clamp this long tail onto the work. So this piece actually gets clamped onto the face like this, if you imagine that these were big boards. So you put a clamp here and a clamp here, and then the sandpaper allows the jig, the clamping jig, to stay on the piece and not slide. And that way, when you use two of them, you can now apply that clamping pressure here and here like we need. Now, this works great if you've got a fairly narrow piece that you're joining, but when you've got a huge desk that's 600 wide, it's very difficult to get the pressure you need into the center. What I've come up with instead is a clamping caul that is as wide as the workpiece. It's essentially the same design. I mean, this thing cost me nothing. I had scrap ply, a bit of sandpaper, and this chunk of hardwood. The sandpaper is held on with double-sided tape, and then the triangle piece is glued on. In this case, I use polyurethane, but you can use PVA. The plywood is 12mm ply. That worked great. It's more than stiff enough. You could use thicker, use whatever you've got. You could use MDF, it would also work fine. This could work for a much wider desk. It could work for a table that was 1200 wide if you had a really big slab that you were trying to waterfall. But it means you can get that clamping pressure exactly where you need it, and it is really consistent and it's not going to slip and it's not going to fail on you. The sandpaper is applied on the edges because that's where the clamps are that stop this whole thing sliding forward, and it's applied along the top underneath that triangular block so that when the clamps are on the triangular block to draw the joinery together, it's gripping onto that sandpaper, which means this thing won't slide at all. When you're trying to clamp a miter joint like this, it's important to know where the line of force is. So we want our clamping force to be directed through the center of this big long miter edge, not close to the top or close to the bottom, because that will make it uneven. So by using a square, we can draw a line through the center of the joint, roughly, and we can extend that line up to where our clamps are going to sit, which in this case is more or less right in the center of this big clamping block. So that looks perfect to me. I guess I'm just trying to demonstrate that if you put this back here, the place that the force is actually being directed to is below the joint, which will mean that it is clamping unevenly and is actually trying to fold the joint rather than close it. So the position of your clamping cauls is important. I am very close to gluing this Waterfall desk together, and I'm ready to mix the glue. Now, I'm going to be using Techniglue for this, which is a 2-part epoxy adhesive. It also has good gap filling properties. If you want to, you can use it, you can tint it and use it as a filler. It's a 2-to-1 mixture. I'm going to measure it out as I use my little scales for all kinds of things like this. You could do it by eye, it would probably still work. I approach everything with an abundance of caution. I will put 2 parts onto this piece of plywood. I'll mix them all up, and then once they're fully mixed, I will use a clean stick to scrape the mixed glue into a clean container. That means that there's 0 chance of there being unmixed glue in my joint. If you're mixing in the same container that you're then using to apply the glue, there's a chance that small bits of unmixed either hardener or the resin are on the sides, and then that can contaminate your joinery because that will never set. It is always worth applying some blue tape on the inside of the miter join before you glue it up. I think let the tape sit about 1/2 mil away from the joining surface so that it's not going to get trapped within the join. And then that makes the cleanup so much easier afterwards. One of the reasons I'm using epoxy rather than a PVA is that PVA has a tendency to grab just once the wood touches the other piece of wood. So when you're using dominoes on a complicated join like this, I've found a couple of times that when I've used PVA and my joinery is all really tight, as I'm applying clamps, the join will seize up before I have got it where I need it to go. On the other hand, Techniglue is very slippery and it will not set until it chemically sets, until the time is up. So for that reason, it gives you a bit more time. It means that the joins slide together a lot more easily. And I just wouldn't risk using PVA on a waterfall join like this anymore because over the years, it has just caused me troubles. Doing a glue up like this by yourself is challenging because there's no one to kind of lift things into place while you're trying to get those dominoes to go into their holes. So make sure you've thought about that beforehand. So I used some timber on the floor and some wedges to help me get that into position. And then I used some soft clamps like this to kind of draw everything together. These aren't used for the actual clamping. This just holds things in place while I put my F clamps on. I checked everything for square while it was still wet. Now, in the event that it wasn't square, there's a couple of things you can do. Just try and move it slightly. That might be enough. Check for square again. You can move the position of the clamps slightly, either closer to the top edge of your cauls if you want to open that joint up, or closer to the bottom of your cauls if you want to close that joint up. That might help a little bit. All in all, that went really well. The glue joins look good. None of my cauls slipped. Dominoes all lined up. Happy days. Look at that miter. It is crisp and clean. There are no gaps. Beautiful straight line that is basically invisible. That's what makes me happy. And that is why I do the prep and make the jigs and make sure everything is going to work so that I don't end up in a situation, which I have been in before, where you're halfway through gluing it up and it's just not going together. Because that is a terrible feeling and you only want to experience it once, and then you do what I do, which is make lots of clamping jigs. I don't have much left to do on this. I'm going to put a little bit of black filler in these sap lines, which I'm actually going to do as a separate video because it's worth talking about on its own, and then apply some oil, and then it's ready to get delivered. I hope you've got something out of this. I think that if you're ever gluing up mitres, whether it's a waterfall or not, that clamping method using the sandpaper jigs is just the cleanest way that I've found to do it and the least anxiety inducing. So thanks for watching. I hope to see you next week. Let me know how you prefer to do waterfall and mitre joints. Maybe you've come up with a brilliant way that you want to share. I'm more than happy to chat about that. Don't forget to like and subscribe. There'll be some links below to some of the products I've used, and I'll see you next week. Thanks for joining me.